All right, welcome everyone to another deep dive with us.
Yeah, excited to be here.
Today we're going to be tackling a topic that's, I don't know, kind of a heavy one, kind of a fascinating one.
Definitely both.
It's nihilism, but we're not just going to be talking about, like, the dictionary definition of nihilism.
Yay.
We're going to be talking about nihilism as it's presented in the writings of Father Seraphim Rose.
Yes.
Who, I think it's fair to say, is a pretty intriguing figure.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And in particular, what we're going to be looking at today is what we've got excerpts from his book, Nihilism, The Root of the Revolution of the Modern Age.
Catchy title.
Yeah.
I mean,
get you right in.
It's a very Father Seraphim Rose kind of title, I think. But alongside that, we've also got a glimpse into his life from the book's introduction, written by Monk Damascene.
Yeah, so that's super helpful for us because it gives us this biographical context for how Rose connects nihilism to this concept of the revolution of the modern age, which is a lot of what we're going to be talking about. And it's, I mean, speaking of this kind of biographical context, we can't really talk about Father Seraphim Rose without talking about, like, his conversion story. Yeah. Which is, I don't know, it's not your typical, went on a retreat and found God kind of story.
It's not your typical conversion story. No, not at all.
So, okay, picture this. Like, here's Seraphim Rose before he becomes a monk. Right? Yeah. He's like deep into Eastern religions, philosophy, even like existentialism, right? We're talking about like a guy who is seriously searching for truth, but nothing's clicking for him.
Yeah.
And then he kind of, almost by accident, he walks into an Orthodox church in San Francisco.
Not exactly the, hotbed of Eastern Orthodoxy.
Right. Not exactly where you'd expect to find, like, a huge Orthodox population.
No.
And, like, it's not like he has this sudden epiphany or anything like that.
Yeah, he doesn't, no, it's not, it's not
like, boom, a lightning bolt.
Exactly. It's not like, scales fall from his eyes.
He describes it as this feeling of coming home.
Right.
Right. Even though he doesn't even understand a word of the service.
It's wild, isn't it?
Yeah.
That it's like, it's not about the ritual or anything. It's something deeper.
It's that sense of truth.
Exactly.
That he, like, hadn't found anywhere else.
Yeah.
And this leads to, I think, a really interesting point about how Rose understands truth, right? Mm-hmm. It wasn't just this abstract idea for him. It was a person.
Right, and that person.
Which ultimately led him to Christ.
Led him to Christ, yeah.
And, his early writings are super fascinating because it's almost like he's processing this huge shift, right? Mm-hmm. Like contrasting the pain of what he calls the kingdom of man with this, like, glimpse of hope in the kingdom of God.
Yeah, and that's key, I think, for grasping his take on nihilism as a whole.
Yeah.
That he truly believed that to fully come to Christ, modern man, and I think it means all of us, right?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Needs to first confront this nihilism within themselves and society as well.
Yeah, and that it wasn't just some kind of, like, intellectual problem.
Right.
It was a spiritual problem.
Exactly, spiritual disease almost.
So when Rose talks about nihilism, he's not talking about, like, moody teenagers in black, right?
Right. No. He's not talking about, like, a phase, like you don't go through.
It's digging into something much deeper. But, like, what is that? How does he define nihilism in his work?
Well, so he defines it as this core belief. There is no absolute truth.
Okay.
And that's huge,
It's
right?
a big one.
Because if there is no absolute truth, then everything becomes relative, right?
Yeah.
And if everything's relative, then ultimately nothing really matters.
Right. So it's not just like, oh, what's true for you is true for you, and what's true for me is true for me. It's like, if there's no ultimate truth, then
nothing matters.
Then what's the point?
Yeah, exactly.
Of, like, anything, really.
Exactly. And he links this back to Nietzsche's famous God is dead declaration.
Wait, can you, like, remind me what the full quote is? Because I feel like
this gets thrown around a lot.
Yeah, like God is dead, but, like, what does that actually mean?
Yeah, so the full quote is, God is dead, therefore man becomes God and everything is possible.
Okay.
And see, what Rose picked up on is this idea that without a grounding in a higher power, in objective truth, humanity's just adrift.
Okay.
And that can lead to some pretty unsettling conclusions.
Yeah, no kidding. So if there is no absolute truth, then how does that affect, like, well, everything?
Everything.
How do we make decisions, have morals? Like, how do we even know what's real anymore?
It's a great question. Yeah, like, how do we function?
Yeah, how do we function as, like, human beings in the world?
Right. So Rose doesn't just leave us hanging with that question.
Okay, good.
He proposes this concept called the nihilist dialectic.
Okay.
Which is outlined in his table of contents. It's basically like a roadmap showing us how nihilism progresses.
Okay.
And spoiler alert, it gets kind of intense.
Okay, in what way?
Like, what's the destination?
Yeah, where are we going?
Yeah, so he lays out 4 stages: liberalism, realism, vitalism, and the grand finale, the nihilism of destruction.
Okay, that doesn't sound ominous at all. Nihilism of destruction.
No, not at all, babe.
Okay, let's break this down, like stage by stage.
Okay.
Starting with liberalism.
Okay.
And like, we should be clear, this is not about, like, Democrats versus Republicans.
No, he's not talking about political parties.
Right, not about liberal versus conservative politics.
Right.
This is something different.
Yeah, he's talking about the weakening of absolute truth, which he saw as a defining characteristic of the modern age.
Okay.
This leads to a growing indifference to anything beyond, like, material pursuits.
So it's like we become so focused on, like, comfort and stuff that we kind of lose sight of any, like, higher purpose.
Exactly.
Okay.
And from liberalism, we move on to the next stage, which Rose calls realism. Now, here, scientific knowledge is seen as the only valid form of truth. Anything, quote-unquote, higher, any spiritual or metaphysical reality, is dismissed.
So it's like the ultimate triumph of the material world, right?
Yeah.
You would just become totally focused on what we can see and measure.
Yeah.
Okay.
And, that might seem harmless enough, even logical to some, but Rose argues that this purely materialist worldview actually paves the way for the 3rd stage, vitalism.
Okay, what's so interesting about vitalism?
Well, with vitalism, objective truth, something that exists outside of ourselves, is completely replaced by subjective experience. So feeling becomes more important than knowing. And individual perception trumps any kind of external reality.
It's like the ultimate expression of, like, my truth, right?
Exactly.
But how does that play out, like, in the real world?
Well, Rose saw it happening all around him even back then. It manifests as this constant hunger for the new and exciting. You see it in, like, the relentless pursuit of novelty, the obsession with, like, fleeting trends, and inability to find satisfaction in anything lasting.
Like, we're talking about, like, the iPhone 14 comes out and then everyone wants the iPhone 15.
Exactly, yeah.
Or, something goes viral and then everyone forgets about it, 2 days later.
2 days later, yeah.
But isn't this just, like, human nature?
Yeah.
To, like, want the next thing?
That's what some people might say.
Right.
But Rose would argue, no, it's not just human nature. It's actually a symptom of this deeper spiritual crisis.
Okay.
It's a direct result of embracing a worldview where there's no ultimate meaning. And this constant craving, this restlessness that we see, actually sets the stage for the final and most troubling stage of nihilism.
Okay, so here comes the nihilism of destruction.
Exactly.
What exactly does Rose mean by this?
This is where the rubber meets the road, right? This is where the rejection of any inherent meaning or value in existence leads to, well, a willingness to destroy. It's the embrace of violence and chaos as a means to an end, or even as an end in itself.
Okay.
Think about it. If nothing truly matters, then what's stopping anyone from doing anything?
Yeah, that's kind of a chilling thought. So are we doomed? Is that it? Are we all just going to descend into this, like, abyss of meaninglessness and destruction?
Well, so, I mean, Rose wouldn't be a very effective spiritual guide if he just pointed out the problem without offering any solutions, right? But before we get into the solutions, I think it's important to understand what he saw as, like, the root cause of this whole descent into nihilism.
Okay, so it's not just about, like, rejecting traditional values or embracing science. Like, what's the deeper issue here?
The deeper issue is rebellion.
Okay.
Rebellion against God, truth, and authority. It's this fundamental rejection of anything higher than ourselves. A refusal to acknowledge any power that could impose limits on our desires or actions.
So it's like the ultimate expression of individualism taken to its logical extreme.
Yes, exactly. Okay. And this rebellion actually creates what Rose calls an abyss within us, a spiritual void that we try to fill with, fleeting experiences, material possessions, ideologies. But nothing can truly satisfy this emptiness because it stems from a rejection of our true nature, which is to be in communion with God.
So it's not just like an intellectual rejection of truth, but it's like a spiritual disconnect, right?
Exactly.
Like a severing of our connection to something bigger than ourselves.
Precisely.
Okay.
And Rose believed that this disconnect, this worship of nothingness, as he called it, has very real consequences for individuals and for society as a whole. It manifests in what he calls the nihilist program.
Hold on, a program? That sounds a little, I don't know, conspiracy theory-ish.
I know. Exactly.
What exactly is this program supposed to achieve?
So, well, it's not a program in the sense of like a secret society or a group of people plotting in a back room or something like that.
Okay.
Rose is talking about a pattern of ideas and behaviors that he saw emerging from this nihilistic worldview. And it's a pattern that unfortunately seems to be playing out, all around us.
Oh, okay. So like, what are the steps in this so-called program?
Well, the first step, according to Rose, is the destruction of the old order.
Okay.
This means dismantling traditional institutions, values, and ways of life that are rooted in, well, Christian truth. Think about the decline of, like, traditional family structures, the erosion of religious belief, the questioning of authority figures. Rose saw all of this as part of this process of dismantling the old world to make way for the new. Okay,
so the old ways are swept away, then what? What does this, like, brave new world look like?
Well, that's where the second prong of the nihilist program comes in, which is the making of a new earth.
Okay.
Rose believed that this involved creating a totally organized, efficient, and worldly focused society, one that prioritizes material prosperity, technological advancement, and human progress as like the ultimate goals.
It almost sounds like a utopian vision.
Right, yeah.
But one built on a foundation of nihilism, which seems kind of like, I don't know, paradoxical.
It is paradoxical, yeah. And Rose saw this paradox play out in the third prong of the nihilist program, the fashioning of the quote-unquote new man.
Okay.
Which refers to the creation of essentially a rootless, autonomous, and ultimately dehumanized individual.
Okay.
It's about stripping away any sense of like inherent meaning or purpose from human existence and replacing it with a purely materialist and self-serving ethos.
So we all just become like cogs in this nihilistic machine. Is there like no hope for escaping this program?
Well, so Rose did identify one more element of the nihilist program, and it's a tricky one.
Okay.
He called it the New Age delusion.
The New Age delusion.
Yeah, and this is the belief that there's a positive future, quote unquote, beyond nihilism. That somehow this whole process of destruction and rebuilding will lead to a better world.
So even nihilism has its own kind of like utopian vision.
Exactly.
Okay.
But Rose believed that this was a false hope, a dangerous distraction that prevented people from confronting the true spiritual crisis at hand.
Okay.
He saw it as the culmination of the revolutionary program, like a final attempt to disguise the emptiness at its core. And he believed that ultimately it led down a path towards what he called the reign of Antichrist.
Okay, hold on. Antichrist. Now we're getting into some serious theological territory here.
Yeah, I know.
So maybe before we go there, let's take a moment to unpack this idea of the New Age delusion a bit further.
Sure.
What exactly did Rose find so problematic about the seemingly, like, optimistic view of the future?
Well, I mean, for Rose, the problem wasn't the desire for a better world. He understood that longing for peace and harmony and spiritual fulfillment.
Yeah.
But he saw the New Age movement as, like, misdiagnosing the problem and therefore offering false solutions.
So what did he see as, like, misdiagnosed? Where did the New Age go wrong, in his view?
Rose argued that the New Age, despite its emphasis on spirituality and personal transformation, was still fundamentally rooted in the same nihilistic worldview that it claimed to transcend.
Oh, so it's like saying they were trying to fight fire with fire.
Exactly.
And using the same flawed tools that created the problem in the first place.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Okay.
Rose believed that the New Age was essentially trying to build a spiritual house on a foundation of sand. It might look appealing on the surface,
right?
But it lacked the solid grounding in objective truth that he saw as essential for genuine spiritual growth.
I'm starting to see why this idea of the New Age being a delusion was so central to his critique of nihilism. But, like, we haven't even touched on this whole concept of the reign of Antichrist yet, and I have a feeling that's a whole other can of worms.
A whole other can of worms.
So maybe we should, like, take a pause here.
Yeah, let's take a break.
Come back after we've had a chance to, like, digest all this information.
Absolutely.
About the New Age and its connection to Rose's, broader critique of nihilism. And then we'll dive into this concept of the reign of Antichrist.
Sounds like a plan.
And explore how Rose connects it to like the rise of nihilism in the modern world.
Let's do it.
We'll be back in a moment.
Okay, so picking up where we left off, I think it's important to clarify that when Father Rose talks about the reign of Antichrist, he's not talking about like, some literal demonic figure.
Right, like horns and a pitchfork.
Exactly, yeah, like taking over the world.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, when they hear that phrase, they immediately jump to that kind of like Hollywood image of the Antichrist.
Right, it's like the movies.
Yeah.
But for Rose, the Antichrist is more of a concept, culmination of this like anti-Christian spirit that he saw growing, for centuries. And he believed that nihilism, with its rejection of absolute truth and its embrace of, worldly power, was paving the way for this reign.
So instead of like, a single bad guy, it's more like a system, like a way of thinking and being.
Exactly.
As opposed to like the values of Christianity.
Yeah, and Rose saw this reign of Antichrist manifesting in like subtle but pervasive ways, gradually eroding the spiritual foundations of society.
Yeah.
He pointed to several trends that he saw as indicative of this like encroaching reign.
Okay.
And I think some of them might like resonate with you even today.
Okay, let's hear. What are some of these signs that Father Rose was talking about?
One trend that he highlighted was the rise of what he called the man god.
The man god.
Yeah, it's the individual who elevates themselves above all traditional authority and claims like absolute autonomy.
Okay.
It's the idea that like I am the master of my own destiny, that no one, not even God, can tell me what to do or how to live.
And we definitely see that reflected in our culture today, right?
Oh, yeah.
Like this celebration of individual achievement.
Yes.
The pursuit of like self-fulfillment above all else.
Yeah, like self-actualization.
Right.
The rejection of any kind of like limitations on personal freedom.
Yeah.
All of that.
It's like a kind of idolatry of the self, right?
Exactly.
Like replacing God with a human ego.
Yeah, and Wright saw this as a dangerous trend because it leads to like a fragmentation of society, a breakdown of community, and ultimately a loss of meaning and purpose.
Because if everyone is their own God, then who decides what's right and wrong?
Exactly.
Like whose values prevail?
Right. It becomes this kind of like spiritual free-for-all where everyone is fighting for their own interests and no one can agree on like a common good.
Okay. And so Rose also talked about this, like growing secularization of society as a sign of the times, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Like the decline of religious belief and the elevation of like material values over spiritual ones.
That was a huge concern for him.
Yeah.
He saw this secularization as a symptom of that deeper spiritual crisis, this loss of faith in anything beyond the material world.
Right. So it's not just that people are like, not going to church as often.
Right.
It's like
it's a deeper issue.
Like a fundamental shift.
Exactly.
In how we like view the world.
Exactly. And he believed that this loss of faith had like serious consequences for the moral and spiritual health of society.
Yeah, because, I mean, without a shared sense of values.
Right.
Like, without a belief in something higher than ourselves, then what's to stop us from just pursuing our own selfish desires?
Exactly. And that was the danger that Rose saw. He believed that without a strong spiritual foundation, society would inevitably descend into, chaos and anarchy.
So, okay, we've got the man God, we've got the decline of religious belief. Were there any other trends that Father Rose kind of pointed to as signs of this like reign of Antichrist?
Yeah, he also highlighted the rise of what he called new spirituality.
New spirituality.
Yeah, this kind of like eclectic mix of Eastern mysticism, occult practices, and like pseudo-psychological theories that promise like personal transformation, but lack any grounding in like genuine spiritual truth.
It's like that whole spirituality light phenomenon.
Yeah, it's like,
like a way to feel connected to something higher without having to like actually commit to a specific religious tradition.
Right, or a moral code.
Right, exactly.
And Rose saw this as a dangerous trend because it often led people astray, enticing them with promises of like easy enlightenment or like quick fixes to their problems.
Yeah, like, 5 steps to like instant enlightenment.
Yeah, of course, exactly. But he believed that like true spiritual growth required like discipline, commitment, and a willingness to submit to a higher authority.
So it's not enough to just dabble in different spiritual practices or cherry pick the beliefs that, appeal to us.
Not for Rose, no. He believed that, genuine spirituality required a deep commitment to truth, a willingness to, confront our own flaws, and a desire to align our lives with the will of God.
So, okay, so it sounds like Father Rose was pretty pessimistic about the state of the world.
I mean, he was a realist. And if all these trends are pointing towards this reign of Antichrist, as he believed, is there any hope for resisting this? Or are we all just doomed? Well, Rose wasn't a doomsayer.
Okay.
He was a realist, as we said, who saw the dangers, but also believed in the possibility of change.
Okay.
And he believed that the key to resisting this encroaching darkness lay in a return to traditional Christian faith.
Okay.
Specifically within the Orthodox tradition.
So he's saying that the answer isn't political activism or social reform, but it's like a spiritual awakening.
Exactly. Yeah. Rose saw this battle against nihilism as a spiritual battle. And he believed that the only way to win this battle was to strengthen our connection to God, to root ourselves in the unchanging truths of the Christian faith.
But why specifically the Orthodox tradition?
So Rose believed that the Orthodox Church had preserved the true faith in its purest form, untainted by the compromises and innovations of Western Christianity. He saw it as this living tradition that had remained faithful to the teachings of the apostles and the early church fathers.
But isn't that a bit exclusive?
Well,
surely there are people of good faith in other Christian denominations who are also resisting these negative trends.
Rose acknowledged that, yeah, absolutely. He acknowledged that there are genuine Christians in other traditions, but he believed that the Orthodox Church offered the most complete and authentic expression of Christianity. Okay.
The purest path to salvation in a world increasingly dominated by, spiritual deception.
So for Father Rose, the solution to the crisis of nihilism wasn't to try to change the world from the outside, but to transform ourselves from the inside out.
Yes, that's a great way to put it. Yeah. He believed that true change had to begin with a personal transformation, a turning away from the self-centeredness of the modern world and a turning towards God.
So he's essentially calling for a kind of spiritual counter-revolution.
You can say that, yeah, Rose believed that the only way to truly confront the darkness of nihilism was to, embrace the light of Christ. And he saw the Orthodox Church as, the beacon of that light in a world increasingly shrouded in shadows.
And I can see how his personal journey really shaped his perspective on all of this.
Absolutely.
He went from being lost in a world of, philosophical and spiritual searching to finding, a deep sense of meaning and purpose within the Orthodox tradition. Yeah, and he believed that this same path was open to anyone who was willing to seek it out, to open their hearts and minds to the possibility of something beyond the limitations of, the material world.
But this is a pretty radical message, right?
It is, yeah.
It requires a profound leap of faith, a willingness to, step outside the dominant worldview of our time and embrace a tradition that might seem, foreign or even outdated to many.
Rose understood the challenge, but he believed that the stakes were too high to ignore. He saw the future of humanity hanging in the balance, and he believed that the only hope for true liberation lay in a return to the spiritual roots of Western civilization.
So what does this all mean for our listeners?
Yeah.
What are some practical steps they can take if they're intrigued by this path of spiritual resistance that Father Rose is advocating for?
The first step, perhaps, is simply to become aware of the problem, to recognize the subtle ways in which nihilism might be operating in their own lives and in the culture around them.
It's like that famous quote, the first step to recovery is admitting you have a problem.
Exactly.
But in this case, it's not just a personal problem, it's a societal one as well.
Precisely. And we need to develop a critical awareness of the messages we're constantly bombarded with, the assumptions we make about the world, the values that are shaping our choices. And once we have that awareness, then we can start to explore the alternatives.
Okay. And for those who are interested in specifically exploring the Orthodox tradition, what would you recommend as a starting point?
There are lots of resources available, both online and offline. Local Orthodox churches often offer introductory classes or study groups.
Okay.
There are also numerous books and websites that provide an overview of Orthodox beliefs and practices.
And I think it's important to emphasize that Father Rose's perspective is just one perspective.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right, albeit a very thought-provoking one.
Oh, yeah.
But we want to encourage our listeners to do their own research.
Yes.
To explore different viewpoints.
Absolutely.
And to ultimately come to their own conclusions about the nature of nihilism and its implications for their lives.
Critical thinking is essential in a world of information overload.
Yeah, absolutely.
We need to engage with these ideas thoughtfully and discerningly, always seeking, truth and wisdom wherever they might be found.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, exploring the complex and often challenging ideas of Father Seraphim Rose.
We have.
His perspective on nihilism offers a, unique and, dare I say, controversial lens through which to view the spiritual landscape of our time.
It's a perspective that demands, serious consideration, whether one ultimately agrees with Rose or not.
Yeah.
His writings raise important questions about the direction of our culture, the nature of truth and meaning, and the role of faith in a world that seems, increasingly hostile to the transcendent.
And I think it's safe to say that this conversation won't end here.
No.
Father Rose's work has a way of sparking deeper reflection and prompting us to grapple with some of the big questions that often get pushed aside in our busy lives.
You're right. And those questions are ultimately at the heart of the human experience, right?
Yeah.
What is the meaning of life? Why are we here? What is our purpose? These are questions that every generation wrestles with.
Yeah.
And Father Rose's perspective offers one possible answer.
So we still got some ground to cover in terms of, what his proposed solutions are. But maybe, to wrap up this this part of our deep dive, we can focus on some key takeaways from Father Rose's work and maybe leave our listeners with a final thought to ponder as they continue their own exploration of these ideas.
Sounds good.
All right. So welcome back to our deep dive into nihilism. As seen through the eyes of Father Seraphim Rose.
Yeah.
We've explored some, pretty heady concepts, from the stages of nihilism to this idea of the reign of Antichrist and how Rose saw it connected to, the decline of spiritual values in the modern world.
Right. But while Rose's, diagnosis might seem kind of bleak, he wasn't about just, leaving us in a state of despair.
Right.
He actually offers a path forward, a way to kind of counter this nihilistic worldview that he saw as so pervasive.
Right. Because, if we just focus on the problem without offering any solutions, what's the point?
Right. Exactly.
It becomes an intellectual exercise in pessimism.
Yeah.
And Rose was anything but a pessimist.
Right.
He was a deeply spiritual man who believed in the power of faith to transform individuals and ultimately to heal society. So for him, the answer wasn't about trying to change the external world through political or social means, but about a much, deeper, more internal shift in our values and our understanding of ourselves.
Precisely. He believed that the battle against nihilism had to be fought on a spiritual level, and that the weapons of this warfare were, the traditional practices of Christian faith, prayer, fasting, repentance, and a life lived in accordance with the teachings of Christ.
And while, he specifically advocated for, the Orthodox path.
Yeah.
I think there's a broader message here that resonates, even for those who, might not be drawn to organized religion.
Absolutely. Yeah. At its core, Rose's critique of nihilism is really a critique of this modern tendency to prioritize the material over the spiritual, to elevate human reason above divine revelation. He's calling for a radical reorientation of our values, a shift from a self-centered worldview to one that recognizes our dependence on God and our interconnectedness with all of creation.
It's like he's saying that we've lost sight of something essential, something that gives meaning and purpose to our lives.
And that something for Rose was the truth of the Christian faith. He believed that only by reconnecting with this truth, by grounding ourselves in the teachings and practices of the church, could we find true meaning and purpose in a world that seems increasingly bent on self-destruction.
So what does all this mean for our listeners? What are some practical takeaways from this this deep dive into the world of nihilism through the eyes of Father Seraphim Rose.
Maybe the most important takeaway is just this recognition that nihilism isn't just like a philosophical concept. It's a lived reality that shapes our thoughts, our feelings, and our actions. It's that sense of meaninglessness that can kind of creep into our lives when we prioritize the material over the spiritual, when we like lose sight of the transcendent in pursuit of, you know, worldly success.
It's a feeling of emptiness that no amount of stuff or achievement can seem to fill.
Exactly. And it's the despair that can kind of settle in when we believe that there's, you know, nothing beyond this life, no ultimate purpose or meaning to our existence.
Yeah.
But Rose offers a like counter narrative, a path of like hope and healing.
Okay.
He reminds us that we're not alone in this struggle, that there's a source of, you know, truth and love that transcends the limitations of our like human understanding.
And he challenges us to, you know, open ourselves to this truth.
Yeah.
To seek it out, to allow it to transform our lives from the inside out.
He's not offering like easy answers or like quick fixes, but like a path of spiritual growth and transformation that requires effort, discipline, and a willingness to like surrender to something greater than ourselves.
Right. It's not a path for the faint of heart.
No, not at all.
But for those who are willing to embark on this journey, Rose offers a promise of, you know, true liberation, of freedom from the chains of nihilism, and a life, you know, filled with meaning and purpose.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with this final thought. If Father Rose is correct in identifying nihilism as a spiritual disorder, what are the spiritual solutions that might exist to counter it?
That's a question that each of us, I think, has to grapple with individually.
Yeah.
But perhaps the journey begins with a willingness to, you know, look beyond the confines of our own ego, to open ourselves to the possibility of something greater, and to seek out the sources of wisdom and guidance that have sustained humanity throughout the ages.
Well said.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the thought-provoking world of Father Seraphim Rose.
Yeah, this was a good one.
Until next time, keep seeking, keep questioning, and
keep the conversation going.
Keep the conversation going.